Hello there. Welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and I have a treat for you all today. I'm joined with Matthew Sands of the Nations of Sanity Project. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
And he is an English feller all the way across the pond over there in England. And you are endeavoring in a project that I like the sounds of a lot. I'm only going to prelude it a little bit by saying that on the welcome page of nationsofsanity.com, you should all go there and check it out. It leads with, quote, "Voluntary is fine, forced is a crime." And those are words that kiss my own heart. So welcome to Haman Nature, Matthew.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to it. First of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? How did you get here ideologically?
I'm just kind of a working class father. I'm no notoriety about me at all in any kind of way. I'm a musician, amateur style. I do delivery as my job. Like I say, nothing spectacular to write home about. With regards to my kind of journey here, I kind of often describe it as saying I was always here, but I wasn't always aware of these labels and these, kind of philosophies and what have you. But I was never a statist that got converted. I was always just like, even before I came across libertarianism, I always kind of believed these things anyway, and just was like, when I came across these terms like the non-aggression principle and libertarian philosophy and that, I was just like, oh yeah, of course, that's me politically, kind of thing. So yeah, but I mean, funnily enough, if I had a real kind of journey here, like where a lot of people came here through, Rothbard or whoever it is they read, sorry. I would probably say my journey was more like as a musician through Bob Marley and the Wailers. And he's not a libertarian in the traditional sense, but he is in the way that I was, in the way that he believes in freedom and preached that and rights and again, get up, stand up for your rights and obvious song and stuff, and so that was always kind of like, what I believed anyway. And then I just came across like things like libertarianism, and that just helped me kind of intellectualize it a little bit more and connect a lot of dots, logically, with things that I think not just me, but I think all of us are libertarians person to person, with the exception of actual criminals. But, most decent people interpersonally are very libertarian. They have a disconnect when it comes to government, unfortunately. But I just wasn't one of those people that I never kind of bought into, taxation always kind of struck me as being theft and, drug laws always struck me as kind of being incoherent, because it's like, well, if it's bad for them, it's their choice kind of, so all of these things never really kind of jive with me. And when I came across libertarianism, it was kind of nice to like realize that there's a label for it and other people that think the same way, and realize that the world isn't currently like that, even though it probably should be,
It's funny. There's a saying in our circles that you learn everything you need to learn about morality on the playground in the sandbox, right? Don't hurt people, don't hurt other people, and don't take their stuff. And then oddly enough, they ship you off to a government school and you learn all these exceptions to that, otherwise known as statism. Who would have thunk it? The government's going to teach you to worship and need the government. So you mentioned Rothbard. Would you call yourself then an ANCAP, anarcho-capitalist, or are you a minarchist or something in between? How would you? Labels are fuzzy and awkward, but if you had to label yourself, what would you do?
With the term I prefer is voluntarist, but yeah, basically anarchist. I'm what I would call full libertarian. Minarchists, bless their heart, are really still statists. They're kind of like all inconsistent libertarians, if you want to kind of put a kind of spin on it. So yeah, I just really feel like anarchism is just, libertarianism taken to its kind of consistent thing. But the only reason why I prefer voluntarism to anarchism is anarchism is one of those words like capitalism, that's kind of, it's got too many different connotations in too many people's minds. Yeah. It brings up too many things that aren't necessarily what you're talking about. Whereas voluntarism, even though it's not such a well-known term, at least it's not so misunderstood, and it's a little bit more explicit about what it's about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess usually over history, I would use anarchist or anarcho-capitalist or something, but lately I've been changing it to voluntarist, and it is entirely to do with that denotation versus connotation issue. I don't need people to have an image of a black-clad, bomb-throwing, maniac the second I say that word. That's not what I seek. I seek order. In fact, I want a peaceful world. I just think you get that from bottom-up free association rather than top-down statist approaches. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think voluntarist is the way to go. So that's awesome. Nice to meet you. I'm very intrigued by your project. Tell me about Nations of Sanity.
Well, the Nations of Sanity Project is based on the assertion that crime and therefore also law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. So basically saying that we need to establish this as law, but we need to do it as the terms of a peace agreement, because one obvious thing comes up when you say law with regards to anarchism and the NAP is that obviously a ruling authority is a violation of this principle. So like a government, you couldn't establish this as law through any kind of ruling authority like a government. But the only other way you could establish it as law is as the terms of a peace agreement. Like a lot of international law works that way already with regards to kind of agreements between nation states, but obviously nation states aren't legitimate. But just to kind of show that the precedent is there with regards to how you establish law. It doesn't have to be a top-down thing. It can be like like I say, a bottom-up thing where it's the terms of peace between, and rather than it between, like I say, being between nation states, which are just criminal and invalid anyway, it's between individual people, which is the only valid metric that we're talking about when we're talking about rights.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is weird that you named your project how you named it, since a nation is a statist construct. If you had it all to do all over again, would you change that moniker, or are you happy with that framework?
I think I'm happy with it. Because I've had that sort of remarked before. I mean, my main focus with the name has more been on the sanity element and kind of saying that, this is bare bottom sanity that that we're aiming for, and I kind of always say that it's not utopian and stuff. But I suppose the other thing about it is and this kind of goes to a point that I think you caught the tail end of in my kind of life space I was on earlier. But one of the things I kind of want to kind of emphasize is, like, we don't have to lose the collectives. We don't have to lose the concept of nations and stuff like that. We just have to lose the coercion. So, like, we currently live in nations of insanity, in regards to the fact that we're ruled by this incoherent system and where the very notion of crime is undermined. And I'm kind of saying, well, let's flip that and let's turn it into nations of sanity. And while that's the freedom that I'm obviously trying to establish would obviously allow people to have no part of any kind of collective nation or any whatever other label you would put on it, and can be the most kind of sovereign individual he wants to be, being completely unaffiliated, and that's perfectly fine. But I really want to emphasize that we can just transform our collectives into non-coercive alternatives, rather than tearing everything down. And not only will that strike at the root of what I consider to be a fundamental problem in our society, but also I think it gives us the smoothest transition to that kind of that final destination. Like a free society is like a North Star that I think we often see as distant and almost unrealistic, almost utopian. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, it's still ambitious, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite so unfeasible if we take it from this element. If we go straight to that route, instead of trying to shrink a government that's forever growing, let's just remove its coercive power and let the market do the rest. Because free market principles of meritocracy can apply to a collective just as much as they apply to a business when you take out the coercion. Because then whether they're supported by paying customers or whether it's being supported by, say, for example, a local community that's part of some kind of community infrastructure, that are paying it through something that might be very similar to taxation in the way that it's set up, but is not taxation simply because they have that choice and they are paying it voluntarily. And then I feel like there's no better guard against corruption, because, again, the coercion in our collectives is what guarantees the corruption. And when you remove that coercion, the corruption can't survive, because if something that you're paying into becomes that corrupt, if you're part of some membership, you just, okay, well, I'm leaving this club now. Good luck. You know what I mean? And it will die its appropriate death, as anything that's not worth sticking around would in a free society. That's why if we focus on the root of freedom, a lot of other things. Otherwise I feel like we're trying to put out fires without dealing with the guy with the throwing gasoline everywhere. You know what I mean? It's like, sort him out, and it's easier to put out the fires.
Yeah, if we could just get rid of the darn coercion. When I was a young libertarian and still a minarchist, that's funny. It was 1990. I read my first Ayn Rand novel. It was The Fountainhead, and I felt something shift in me. And then I read Atlas Shrugged, and then everything else, and I'm like, oh my God, this is it. We can live in freedom. The people just have to read this. This is 1990, and then I read the date of publishment. 1957. I'm like, oh no, people already have read this, and they just don't want it. So I used to think when I was really, really young that the way we get there is we just educate the masses into realizing that they want to do is be free. And then we can change the government, shrink its size and scope, get people, not wanting this institution, wanting other, more organic, natural institutions that are way less prone to corruption and not based on coercion. But as I get older and older, I start to realize that a lot of people just don't want this. And so if we're going to find freedom, it's got to be something a lot closer to like what happens when an empire falls. We didn't convert the government and make it smaller. It just stopped being effective. And then we found other ways to live, more local forms of authority. So, we build up institutions on the side before the thing, the Leviathan finally collapses. And then we've got these institutions that we can rely on because they're already here. And I'm just wondering, that long preamble, is that the sort of thing you envision, where we just develop parallel institutions and notions and then, sort of wait for the state to evaporate, or do we form secessionist movements where we try and break away? I mean, after all, smaller government does tend to be better than larger, over history and time. How do you think about, you mentioned how we get from here to there. So do you have a vision in your head for the most likely course of action?
Well, yeah, I mean, although I'm not against these kind of more, I can't remember what the word is, but incrementalist. Yeah, that's the word, incrementalist kind of approach. I thought of it as I said, I couldn't think of it. I'm not against that, but that's not what I'm advocating. I'm kind of like, funny enough, I remember speaking to a libertarian one time where they said, oh, we're libertarian or anarchism. We're more about evolution, not revolution. And I was like, actually, I'm more about revolution than evolution. Simply because, and I'm not against the evolution, and everyone who's working, kind of that path to it, I support. But I don't trust it because we haven't got there so far through evolution. The other reason is I feel like we can make a kind of more direct route, like this whole idea of striking at the root of the coercion, like rather than trying to shrink a government, but letting it keep its coercive nature. The problem is that malignancy grows back like a cancer, whereas if we can actually remove the coercion, which I know it's not as simple as me just saying it, but but my point is if that's what we do, it's one simple thing that we do, not an easy thing, but a simple thing. By removing that coercion, we don't have to shrink anything. It will naturally shrink then because it will be subject to the free market principles of meritocracy. So it's like, that's the problem is I feel like we're trying to cut something down to a smaller size while it's still malignant and growing. And I'm like, well, let's transform its nature into a voluntary system. And then it will have to adapt by those market forces because, like I say, the corruption and all the rest of it, if it's corrupt beyond repair, people will just abandon it. And if it's fixable, then the incentive to fix it will be driven by those free market principles that drive, normal businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. One of people's sticking points when I try to describe a voluntarist society is they're like, well, yeah, but you have to have law and order. If you don't have any rules, then what's going to keep predators from just going around and predating? And I just, I just blink at them. I mean, do you think people want maniacs in their society doing maniacal things and casting violence? We still will have men with guns that come take care of people like that. It's just you have to opt into these contracts. And if you decide not to opt into these contracts because you are a maniac, well, then no one ever has to associate with you at all. You will literally be an outlaw. That's what that term used to describe, somebody for whom the law didn't apply. and no one was going to come to protect them if the posse, went out, whether the sheriff was with them or not, and exacted justice. So yeah, I want people to have to be peaceful, even if that isn't in their heart, because there will be consequences. But these things, security and law and courts, these things these are institutions, and they can be organized from the bottom up in a voluntary manner. All you have to do is want to bind yourself down to these rules, and I do. I live in an HOA for that reason. It's just so hard to get people to think like that, because guess what? They've been educated in government schools and have been for over 100 years in this country. Probably longer where you are, right?
Yeah. But as you say, in those same government schools, we all learn more from our parents and, each other than we did from our teachers, but we all learn basically the non-aggression principle.
Yeah.
We did, like I say, it wasn't connected to government and this kind of larger political conversation, but certainly with regards to how we all treat each other. That's what I say I think more people want this than might seem obvious, just because the ideas haven't cottoned on. And one of the reasons why I'm trying to kind of take what I feel is like, because I'm not, I didn't invent libertarianism or anything. The only thing that's kind of unique is I'm just kind of coming at it from a slightly different angle and just saying, well, look, okay, well, there's certain truths that we can kind of build on with regard, like our truth, our individual self-ownership, that kind of moral truth. We can bleat on about all the philosophical justifications for that all day. And that's great. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, because we need to obviously justify our principles. But one of the things I feel like we haven't done as a kind of movement, I mean, there's that joke about, trying to collectivize libertarians is like herding cats with regards to, we're not the most unifying people by nature often. But the fact of the matter is as a kind of movement, we haven't taken the next step for me, which is like the logical next step. Like if we take individual self-ownership as our moral truth, then certain things become objectively identifiable, like self-evident from that presupposition. So if we presuppose individual self-ownership, then we have an objective way to determine property rights through first use principles. We have an objective way to define where your rights and your freedom end with regards to ends when you violate somebody else's and stuff. And that also dictates how we use our property. And so my kind of point is with it is by doing this and leading with that, a lot of the fears that people have, because we associate too much with government that we think that we can't have. It's almost as if, imagine, and please excuse me for the kind of vulgar kind of example, but imagine our society got this far on rape as a way of procreation. It's like saying, well, no, we need to ban that. And people think, well, the human race would end. We wouldn't go on. It's like, well, no, because we can do it voluntarily, believe it or not. And it will be better. You know what I mean? Not to mention, obviously, moral and consistent with our principles. But it's like almost, though it's a crude example, I like to transpose that with anything you want to think of that you can't have because government currently provides it or is currently done in some... you mentioned law and order as a perfect example. We can have law enforcement, just no one's forced to pay for it. And I mean, I personally would opt to personally support a law enforcement that was public serving rather than just one that only protected me. I think that would actually be more efficient to have a public serving community law enforcement rather than just having my own little one that only protects me. And
I think the successful providers in a market setting would agree with you and would do that. I mean, it seems insane to me that it would be viewed selfishly. Fire department too. I would expect a whole lot of public-facing magnanimity and charity. And if that didn't just arise organically, well, we'd be so rich, and charity's a thing, and nobody wants chaos and beatings and fire. Your document on the website, I mean, there were a few of them. I'm curious, did you write that recently, or is that a vestige from when the project started? And how long ago was that? Like, over 5 years, maybe? I'm thinking.
Yeah. I mean, the website is actually pretty old, to be honest, and I haven't updated it but I mean, I haven't changed anything fundamental, but most of my kind of new content is really just videos that I produce on my channel. I think even the most recent article is probably at least 5 years old, or maybe 4 years old, something like that. So it is all pretty old, but it is all... the idea hasn't really changed that much. I mean, my first idea was, let's make the non-aggression principle the law, and pretty much immediately realized the only coherent way to do that would be, as the terms of a peace agreement. The only thing that kind of did evolve a little bit through scrutiny, and conversations and stuff like that, was realizing that there's three dimensions. And as I present this agreement, I present it as like a 3-part peace agreement because it has these 3 dimensions to it, which are kind of critical as part of this agreement. Part 1 is just the basic agreement to establish the Napper's law. Part 2 is what I call the lines in the sand. And that's about setting the limits of tolerance over differing interpretations, because not everybody has precisely the exact same interpretation of the non-aggression principle. And a lot of it is objectively identifiable, but I think we can acknowledge that there's certain issues where there's like grey areas and fuzzy edges. And this is just about drawing a line where it's like a limit of tolerance over different interpretations, where we say, okay, this might be a grey area, but past this point, it's about preserving the black and white so that the grey areas don't infect the black and white to the point that we lose all distinctions, So it's about having that kind of, like I say, a limit of tolerance over different interpretations to kind of set that black and white standard that is enforceable as law. And then part 3 is about ratifying property rights, basically rightful ownership in accordance with the concept of individual self-ownership. So, for example, because sometimes people hear property rights and they might think of what's ratified by government, for example.
Right.
Whereas we're saying, no, you don't own your car because the government says so. You own your car because you voluntarily traded as a self-owning individual with other self-owning individuals. And, the materials are acquired through first use principles and all the rest of it. So we have this underlying principle that kind of dictates everything. And I'm just saying, well, there is an obvious solution that I feel all libertarians should be championing, which is the kind of, well, okay, if the non-aggression principle is the only justifiably enforceable law, then we should make it the law. And if the only way to do that is through a peace agreement, then that's how we should do it. It's kind of like I feel like it's kind of like those final steps on a journey that libertarianism as a whole thing has already gone 95% of the way to. But it's just that kind of final step that I just feel like we need to kind of, it's a little bit like, sorry to labor the point, but it's a little bit like saying, like the slavery abolition. I'm basically saying let's abolish slavery, but let's do it fully. Instead of just abolishing it under the authority of ruling governments, which themselves are criminal, and instead of only doing it to the point of this very specific form of slavery, let's abolish slavery fully at the root, where we're freeing everybody down to their individual self-owning selves, and we're abolishing all forms of slavery, including what currently called government, or what we call statism.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was, as I was reading your document, I was about to give you a little lecture, but I recognize I don't need to, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because the document talks a lot about the non-aggression principle, which is great. I love it. I do want to live in a society where that is viewed as the underlying principle, defining what the rule of law is, what the laws should be. But as libertarian legal theorist Stephan Kinsella reminds us, the non-aggression principle isn't a primary principle. It is dependent on what our property rights theory is. In order to understand what aggression even means, you have to talk about what our property is. That's what aggression has to do with. That's why it's so important to recognize that the first thing we own is ourselves, and almost everything else just spins out from that. So anyway, you were already there, and it sounds like your conception of property rights is pretty much Rothbardian. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Stephan Kinsella, because I have spoken to him about this project, and he has kind of helped me refine my kind of presentation of these ideas by kind of
Good.
I mean, he's been very helpful with this, because, for example, I always used to say with property rights, I always used to say, well, rightful ownership comes from creation or voluntary trade. And even though those are legitimate ways to kind of transfer or further ratify your property ownership, it, like as Stephan pointed out to me, actually comes from first use principles. And the creation and voluntary trade is just what happens afterwards. But your actual ownership comes from first use principles. And not only was that helpful to me with regards to obviously better and more accurately, talking about these principles, but it also helped me draw a more clearer line back to individual self-ownership. Because one of the things I always want to do with everything, when people ask me questions, I always like to draw them a line from the answer to that question right back to self-ownership, and show them how it was. It's almost like showing your work when you do a math sum and showing, well, this is the right answer and this is how we got here. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like the same kind of thing I tried to do. And as I say, Stephan's been very helpful with that. because now I often lead, like when I first used to present this, I used to say, make the nap the law. And I still sometimes say that, but I realized I kind of need to lead with individual self-ownership. And that's why I kind of say now when I present this project, I say we need to define law by the concept of individual self-ownership, which is the principle of that is the non-aggression principle. But it's good to lead with the fact that when we're talking non-aggression principle, we're putting it, as you say, in the proper context of its individual self-ownership, because that's how we're defining aggression, is a violation of your self-ownership. And that's, as you say, how we're defining what our rightful property is. Again, it comes from that first use principle, which comes from individual self-ownership.
Yeah, totally agree. Which order of operations? A lot of times people just can't help themselves. They think that if we have a rule of law, okay, it's this voluntarist one, but it's still, there's just going to be one rule of law for the entire 330 million of us here in this country, because we're a country. And I think that's totally the wrong way to think of it. You will have multiple sources of law, and whether they are popular or not will have to do with whether people opt in to be governed by them or not. And what I envision is a whole bunch of varying areas of your life which are probably governed by different kinds of law. Like if you're super religious in an Amish community, you probably will have a slightly different set of laws that you're going to be bound by if you go on somebody else's property and go to the store and buy some stuff. And if you travel overseas, probably a different one. And these will be set by, I don't know who, insurance companies, communities that just want order. I mean, natural institutions that are organic. I can't tell you what they'll look like, because guess what? They're natural and organic, but they won't be this Leviathan state. They'll be better. But a lot of the verbiage in your website, like you talk about starting the whole thing off with a treaty, that just sounds to me like big old Leviathan nation statey sort of stuff. And I don't think we can co-opt them, you know. I think we have to like move around them or make them irrelevant. Or, I mean, we're 36 trillion in debt, for crying out loud. I don't think this thing can last. But it's like when we first started talking or chatting on some YouTube comment or something, I felt like we were, like you were approaching this thing from a completely different axis than me. I don't get that impression talking to you. So I'm wondering if there's been an evolution, or do you still think this is a nation state thing and we just got to convince everybody to embrace the nap? Or is it more like what I'm saying, that this is a thing individuals opt into because they want a sane way of having law and order that isn't based on your local city council and the governor and the nonsense we live with now?
Yeah, I mean, my goal is very much to overthrow governments and abolish them, much like we abolished slavery and overthrew the slave owners under that kind of thing. So it's kind of a similar kind of attitude, but to kind of attach it to what you're talking about, I think there's an important distinction that I like to make between law and rules. And a little bit, and I kind of make a similar distinction between leaders and rulers. Like, so for example, when I talk about establishing this law and abolishing governments, and I'm abolishing coercion, and I'm saying we're abolishing rulers, but we're not abolishing leaders. We're abolishing, and we're enforcing this law, but we're not enforcing any rules other than this law. And the beauty of this law is that it's purely defensive. So we're not exerting any ruling authority by saying you're not allowed to rape, you're not allowed to murder, you're not allowed to rob other people. Because even if you're not part of our treaty, even if you don't sign our agreement, if you do those things, you're committing an act of aggression. And the force that we would use against you in response, providing it's connected to that and proportionate or necessary, would not be a violation of your rights, because you don't have a right to rape, murder, and assault and all these things. You know what I mean? Like, it's like a difference between, for example, like a drug law, when we're saying you're not allowed to smoke weed, for example, then we're obviously violating your individual self-ownership. And again, this is why I always bring it back to self-ownership and make sure that that's the kind of thing that we're always coming back to with everything we're talking about, because it all comes back to the fact that you have right over only yourself. So that informs us that you don't have the right to rape, you don't have the right to murder, but you do have the right to put whatever you want in your body. Whether it's a good idea or not is a totally different conversation, but whether you have the right to do it is already settled by the fact that it's your body, and the only limitation on what you do with your body comes when you start interfering with other people and their exact same freedom. It's about making this concept of freedom completely universalizable, and this concept of rights completely internally consistent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. Again, going back to the website and some of the verbiage, you say what we need to do is, quote, demand a non-aggression principle-based law. So it raises an obvious question. What do you do when most people just say, nah, no thanks?
I mean, the same thing people did when people were pushing for the abolition of slavery, and enough people were like, nah, you know what I mean? I mean, at some point, I'm hoping to push for a tipping point, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but I think what I'm trying to do, which I think is an important part of getting there, is to identify exactly where we are going and exactly what the path would look like with regards to those kind of basic steps. Like, what is the freedom that we're all advocating for? What is, that kind of, what are rights that we are that we're fighting for? We properly, like you say, and that's why it's such an important point that you brought up. And obviously Stefan Kinsella's spoken about this, about making sure that when we talk about the non-aggression principle, it doesn't get lost what we mean by that with regards to grounding it in the concept of individual self-ownership. Because really all we've got to do is get people on board with this simple moral truth that most people accept anyway, even though they've got the disconnect when it comes to government, they at least accept it, other than the people that we would rightly view as criminals. And I think it's just about making people realize that, unfortunately, a large portion of the group of humans that we would rightly consider criminals are the people who rule over us.
Yes.
And if we fix that problem, though, like I say, it's a simple solution, but it's not an easy solution. And there's the important distinction there. But the simplicity of it doesn't kind of diminish it, because I think it keeps it kind of focused on that one thing. It doesn't like necessarily fix everything, because the other thing about it is, by establishing this freedom, we're kind of letting the market do the rest. You know what I mean? That's the beauty of it, is, like you said, we can't predict exactly how all of these things will be solved. I can't say what will replace every government service. Maybe it will remain some kind of collective that's still very much like a kind of voluntary socialism, if you'll forgive the oxymoron. But you know what I mean? Something kind of like that.
That would be possible in a system of freedom. If you want to do that, you can do that.
But the point is neither of us will be dictating that. It won't be something that we can predict. It won't be something that we can dictate. It will be something that will be the organic expression of free people. And that's just the beautiful part of it. You know what I mean? It's like we fix this base problem, and then we don't have to fix every little mini problem in the world, because it's no longer our right to impose it anyway. And we let free people sort the rest out.
And we're not omniscient, it wouldn't be right for us to, we don't automatically know what the right thing is. So you got to just let people be free. It's funny, you were saying, the sociopaths who rule over us, it's almost like the structure of the system itself attracts people who are evil, like a magnet to the levers of power. It's almost like it was designed that way.
Yeah. Well, I often liken it to, I don't know if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, but I often liken it, like metaphorically speaking, to the power of the ring, and all the people that think they can use it for good. And I just think that ring represents, I mean, perhaps not government specifically, but more the power to rule, whether it's government, whether it's kings, queens, and any other kind of form, slave, or as any other form that it's taken, that power to dominate over others and impose your will over others, as opposed to kind of just respecting their freedom as free individuals. It's like when we feel like we can wield that for good, it just corrupts us. It's because it is an evil thing within itself, so it will corrupt anyone who tries to wield it. And my point is, well, let's abolish it. Let's throw it into the fire, to kind of carry that metaphor on. It needs to be destroyed.
It's a beautiful tale, because it's archetypal. And I use that metaphor all the time in my writing, which you can find at hamannature.com, where my Substack lives. I use that metaphor all the time. Put down the ring of power. The means are the ends. You can't use poison, evil means to achieve good ends. It's literally an impossibility. I totally agree. And I also liked your couple of turns of phrase to describe the difference between statism and voluntarism, and worrying like that there wouldn't be any rules or structure. And the one I tend to use is, there's a big difference between governance, which we all need, and government. Those are orthogonally different things. One is beautiful and organic and gives structure and hierarchy and safety and law, order to a society, and the other is literally just whoever gets the control of the rings of power is lords over you. And guess what? Human nature is corruptible. We're not meant to rule over each other. We're not built for it. Which makes me ask the follow-up question. On your website, it says you state pretty equivocally that morality is objective. I'm inclined to agree, but I have to ask you, where do you think it comes from?
Okay, right. Well, you're going to have to bear with me on this one because
All right.
I will qualify that. I don't think morality is objective in the sense that I can't tell you that morality is true objectively, like the whole is-ought gap. And I've been watching some of your content, so I was watching you speaking with Stefan Kinsella about the is-ought thing. So I know you're familiar with this, but for anyone listening, the whole is-ought thing is basically you can't get an ought from an is, and you're basically saying we can't get morality, what you should do, based on simple facts of what is of reality. And my point is, and I agree with that, you can't do that. So I don't even try to. What I simply say is, yes, even though you can't get an ought from an is, so I can't prove morality is an objective truth. But what I can do is, if we add the hypothetical, because the only way you can get from an is to an ought is to add the hypothetical imperative.
A value statement. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I'm saying that all we need as our hypothetical imperative is that there is such a thing as moral rights. Like, that's all we need. I don't even go any beyond that. Just say, okay, well, let's presuppose there is such a thing as moral rights. Then once we've got that presupposition, I take individual self-ownership. And I don't know if you ever seen like one of those kind of logical trees where you get a question and it gives you like a yes or no, takes you in different directions, and then like another question, and then it takes you to your logical conclusion. Well, if we do that with individual self-ownership, if we accept individual self-ownership as our foundation for rights, rights work. They're coherent, internally coherent, universalizable. It works like mathematics, like saying 2 + 2 = 4, and maths works from there. And that kind of, although that's not a perfect example because maths is obviously also demonstrable, but maths is also logically deducible. And in the same way, this objective framework of morality is logically deducible, because if you don't have individual self-ownerships, then rights make no coherent sense. So the moral truth of individual self-ownership and the objective nature of it, the objective truth of it, it requires the presupposition that there is such a thing as morality. So I'm basically saying, I can't tell you that there is such a thing as rights, but I'm saying that if there is such a thing as rights, they could only coherently exist based on individual self-ownership. And that's what reveals the objective truth of self-ownership as a moral statement.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think there's a few ways you can get there. Hans Hermann Hoppe tried it with argumentation ethics, and there's a couple of different ways. I agree, Hume was right. The is-ought gap, yada, yada, yada. But the thing is, every single person who tries to tell you their theory of morality is basing it on some kind of an is. Even if it's God, the greatest is there is. So, I don't want to hear, usually when somebody tells you that, what they're trying to do is shut you up and get you to quit talking about morality, because it's all subjective after all. You can't, but I think if you just allow a few value statements, like I prefer human flourishing to death and despair, something basic like that, I think you can derive proper moral principles. It's a discovery process because it takes into account human nature, the nature of the universe, and these are essential truths. And as long as you want us to live and not die, be happy, not sad, and have a system of rights that is universalizable, it has to be something a whole lot like what you and I are talking about, where coercion is just not allowed. And then the way people choose to live, that's up to them and their freedom of association and property rights. And we'll see what happens. It figures to be much more beautiful than what any king or democracy would give us.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, it's like people can often point to kind of results, because the thing is as well, is like I always say, you only have to presuppose rights. That's all you have to do. The problem is, I've had debates with objectivists who say, well, you're not justifying rights in the first place. And I'm saying, well, how are you? Because like I said, I don't think the is-ought gap can actually be bridged without adding a hypothetical imperative. You have to, you know what I mean? You can't get a naught from it. Is that remains an undefeated, philosophical statement in my mind. And often objectivists say, well, no, we've done the justification because we're assuming human life is valuable, whatever. I'm like, well, you're still presupposing a hypothetical imperative that you want to preserve human life, or you want flourishing, or, so the only kind of thing that people can say that I'm failing to do is an impossible task anyway, which is justify why we should even have morality. And if I was facing someone who said, I don't believe in morality, might makes right, I can't argue against them. But as soon as they invoke the concept of morality, then I've got them. You know what I mean? Because then logic takes over. It's like, okay, well, if there is such a thing as right, this is the only way it works. And that kind of, sorry.
Oh, no worries. So you're doing great. Yeah, I have a soft spot in my heart for objectivists because I started out there, in my youth. But Ayn Rand couldn't have had the whole thing figured out completely because she was a minarchist till the day she died. And I sort of get it when you grow up in the Soviet Union and you see that horror and you're looking for something big and strong like a nation state to protect you from that horror. I get it. But I think she had a lot of the correct philosophical premises, but she wasn't omniscient either. I don't think she constructed the chain of logic correctly. But again, I'm very sympathetic. Great writer.
But yeah, I mean, well, the thing is I think a lot of things, and again, this is what I'm obviously attempting to try to, hit these points I don't think have been properly hit before, but it's like often with the capitalism versus socialism conversation, like they'll talk about why, obviously private sector is so much more efficient than the public sector. And there's a certain talk over the reason why, but I don't think there's enough focus on that because, as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be about a simple case of, because people are attached to their collectives. And the problem is we associate the coercion of things like roads, or obviously it's obviously a cliche, who will build the roads, and that's just the same as who will pick the cotton with the slavery conversation. It's kind of it's beside the point because the principle is you don't get to force people to pay for the roads. But the fact of the matter is the market finds the answer. But sometimes that answer isn't necessarily that they're all going to be privately owned. Sometimes the answer might be that they'll still be publicly owned, but it'll be privately publicly owned, if that makes sense, in the sense that the local community will all be actual owners, not in the quasi way we are now, where the government basically has control of it. They call it publicly owned, but we don't really have any meaningful ownership over it. But you could have it in a way where you actually really have ownership over it, like if you were a shareholder in a business or something like that. It's just the same idea. And if you don't want to be part of it, you can bail, cash out at any time. And if you want to be part of it, then you're going to work towards preserving it and making it the best that it can be. You know what I mean? So, and again, that's why I say we don't have to predict it. We don't have to dictate it. We can just let freedom do the rest.
Exactly. Yeah, one of the most beautiful things about voluntarism is there are an almost infinite variety of ownership structures for all the things that we normally think of that can only be public, including something very close to what you're describing, an enormous conglomerate that's actually the social contract is signed. Everybody owns a little piece. I don't think that would be very common just because I think there would be an agent ownership problem, the way you see in large corporations. Maybe I think you just want a little bit more control. But the beautiful thing is I could be wrong, and I don't get to force my vision on anybody. If we'll literally get the free association of free people moving their will and their property around in structures and arrangements that suit their interests, and then we'll just see. And I predict beautiful, great things if only I'm still alive to see it. So Matthew, it's been great talking to you. Before you go, is there any place you want to direct people to so that they can join you in finding sanity?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I've got a website, nationsofsanity.com, which, even though I've not updated it for a long time, I've got articles on different topics. So I address different things like, IP or how we build the roads and a lot of these different questions that people ask. So that's always a good place to visit. And then I've got a YouTube channel, Nations of Sanity, as well. I don't get that many comments, so if you put one there, I'll probably see it and reply. And anyone who wants to, I mean, one of the things about this idea is I'm kind of craving two things from people. I'm asked, obviously, support, because I think this is the way to go, and I want everyone to join me in fighting for this. But the other thing is scrutiny, which is just as valuable, because the more people, even if you vehemently disagree with this and you think, no, this won't work because of this, come at me with that, because often I can change your mind or give you an answer that you may not have anticipated, or clarify something, but also it helps me refine how I'm presenting this, and also helps me test it myself. It's like, I like to use the analogy of, like, imagine I built an indestructible vase. I'd want to invite people to come and smash it with a hammer or whatever else they can find to prove that it's an indestructible vase, and not just to them, but to myself. You know what I mean? Because if there's a flaw in this, I want to see it as well. But for me, I feel like there's a certain logical undeniability about this. And I really invite people to either scrutinize or support what I'm doing.
Amen, brother. All right. Well, it's been great having you. We'll put the links to all of these things in the show notes for this video, and also, again, at hamannature.com or hamannature.substack.com, where I put out articles and do other things. Once again, Matthew, this was fabulous. Thanks for coming on, and I'm sure I'll see more of you in the future.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And we'll catch you later on Haman Nature.